This session, this presentation comes out of a paper that I wrote back at the end of December in 2020. And so the reason I'm doing this session is because for two reasons. One, I just wanted to share the ideas that I have with other people. And two is I want to improve my paper. And in fact, just preparing this session has already helped to improve my paper. I'm going to admit some people here. So this background here is philosophically interesting because it's appearance of reality. It is a virtual screen, but it is actually my real bookcase. And this is my granddaughter up there. I think you can see her. And this guy over here is Homo habilis. But so that's a virtual. I have to sit closer to the modem. So I wanted to have a background that worked for me. So before I get started, I want to talk a little bit, just give you the context of this paper and this presentation, let you know what I'm trying to accomplish, what my motivations are, and then I'll talk about the structure of the presentation and how to approach what I'm trying to accomplish here. So I am going to present you guys with a bunch of logical expressions. And I am not at all I'm not an expert in logic, but I think it's fair to say that I'm a student of logic. It started back as a graduate student. They hand you a textbook on formal logic and they say, here, go teach, Logic 101. So we start doing that. But more than that, I spent my professional career in computing. And for those of you who've done computing, you know that it's all about logic, trying to model business processes and writing code. I've written thousands of lines of code. So logic with computers, it's like turtles, right? It's logic all the way down. It's just embedded into the circuitry and it is relentless and unforgiving. So it's just something that I've had available. I've always been interested in logic. And so I have these tools available to me. And I'm just, just have them there. It's just part of the way I think. I'm also, you could fairly say, a student of phenomenology. So I was introduced to phenomenology back as an undergraduate. That was back in the early 70s, quite a long time ago. Introduced to Husserl, Edmund Husserl. And I basically have been studying Edmund Husserl off and on. I had my career in computing. I ran a business. I raised a family. I did all of that stuff. But I've maintained my interest in phenomenology. So I'm interested in doing phenomenology. I'm interested in taking up the phenomenological stance and applying the methodologies of phenomenology, especially Husserlian. When I talk about phenomenology, I generally talk about Husserlian phenomenology. Husserlian, for those of you who don't know, Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, writing about the turn of the 20th century. So I think about these terms in terms of phenomenology. There is a tie with phenomenology and logic. And in fact, for those of you who are not aware or haven't read much Husserl, this is his basic project. The roots of phenomenology are in logic. His masterwork is called the Logical Investigations. Has anybody read Logical Investigations or any parts of that text? One person maybe? It's well worth reading. A couple, great. Especially the Prolegomena is an excellent read. Other texts that Husserl wrote, Formal and Transcendental Logic, Experience and Judgment is another one. And even his text on his methodology, ideas pertaining to phenomenological science, even that text, the first 90, 100 pages or so, is all about logic. So there's this tie between logic and phenomenology. And Husserl actually shared the same project as Frege. Frege was a contemporary of Husserl. They shared the same project, which was to find the foundations or the ground of mathematics and logic, although they went about it in different ways. Frege actually wrote a pretty scathing critique of Husserl's doctoral dissertation, which was on the foundations of arithmetic, the philosophy of arithmetic, I think it was called. But I think ultimately, they did share some ideas. Frege went off and wanted to ground logic using set theory. Husserl wants to ground logic using a description of consciousness. And so those are two entirely different paths to take. But I think ultimately they did agree on the ideal nature of logical objects, that they are not tied to psychology. So Husserl also had an interest in Descartes. We're talking about his description of consciousness. So there is an affinity, a very, very tight, closed affinity between Descartes' method of universal doubt and Husserl's method of the epoche, or suspension of judgment. In 1929, Husserl traveled to Paris and did a lecture. Those lectures were compiled and put into and published as the Cartesian Meditations. So this is another text by Husserl that I would certainly recommend to anybody. And they are used, Husserl uses them as an introduction to phenomenology and as a path to the cogito. And the cogito, by the cogito, I mean the I think, I mean subjectivity, consciousness. Husserl also had the idea of phenomenology as a science. Now, it didn't continue on as the way that Husserl conceived phenomenology to be, but that was his idea. That was the task of phenomenology, is phenomenology as a science. It is epistemological. So all of the sciences use logic, right? But logic is not the subject of those sciences. Physicists could use logic, but they don't talk about the law of non-contradiction. That's not the object of their study. But it is for Husserl, and it is for philosophy. It is the task of philosophy, is to ground knowledge. And in order to ground knowledge, you must ground logic. So as a science, Husserl thought of science as a unified system of statements. And I think that's a pretty good description of science. I mean, you do a lot of things in science, but ultimately it comes down to a set of statements which are logically consistent, not only within a certain discipline, but across disciplines. So that's why he found it so important that we ground logic, and he gave that task to phenomenology. And in his mind, phenomenology is therefore the science of the sciences, the ultimate science. That means that it must ground itself. And as a science, if you're going to do statements, then what you want to do is you want to provide as clear and precise statements as you can. And for me, that means providing logical equations. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm kind of following in the footsteps of Husserl, and I'm looking at Descartes' cogito argument, and I'm asking myself, how can I express this argument using logical expressions? Another reason this talk is phenomenological is because I view these questions from the point of view of phenomenology. And so I will use certain terms, for instance, like intentionality or suspension of judgment, that are phenomenological in nature. But this is a talk about, and a presentation about logic. It's not about phenomenology. It does, I believe, take us right to the doorstep of phenomenology and the doorstep of the cogito, just like Descartes' method of methodological doubt, where he takes us all the way to the statement cogito ergo sum. He takes us all the way to the cogito. And Husserl's method of the epoche, or suspension of judgment, where he reveals what he calls the transcendental field. So this method, or this path that we're going to go down, my assertion is that this is also just another path, a third path that will take us to the cogito. But it will not. We're not going to go on from there. That's just, we're going to go to the doorstep. So Descartes goes all the way to the cogito, but he walks away. Right? He turns around. He wants to reestablish physical nature, belief in God, all of that kind of stuff. And we're not interested in that. We're only interested in the first part, his arguments that take him to the cogito. So the presentation. I'm going to be giving a series of logical expressions. So we're going to walk through these logical expressions. You do not need to try to hold on to these and try to remember them, because I'm going to do that for you. One of the things that I found from people who've read the paper, especially people who are not familiar with the notation of predicate logic, is they just kind of get confused and they kind of lose track. So don't worry about that. Just take a look at each different expression one at a time, and we'll just talk about it, consider that expression. And then we'll go to the next one. So some of these will come in pairs, but I will keep track of this stuff for you. Now, I do want to offer a way for you how you can approach these expressions. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait and show you that when we reach the first one, and I have a format for how I present these. And so at that first one, I'll tell you about how I think you should just, how you should look at these and how you should, approach them each time they come up. And I'll just kind of walk that through. So there'll be a format and an example. The other thing is I want to make sure that we adhere to language. We're talking about language here. We're talking about assertions, statements. We're not talking about things. Assertions talk about things. We're talking about presentations, right? We're talking about propositions. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so can everybody hear and see me okay? Let me see what I've got going here. Are we all good? Any thumbs up? Good. So I was on one of my pandemic walks. I don't know about you guys, but I've been doing a lot of walking during the pandemic. And so I'm just walking and I'm thinking about those kind of things that are of interest to me, and the issues that I think about. And, those are things like subjectivity, consciousness, the I think, all that kind of thing. And I thought to myself, there's a lot of people that attack, or there are a lot of arguments against Descartes' cogito. And I just thought that poor little cogito. 350 years after Descartes presented his arguments, there have been a lot of arguments against the cogito, that it presents an incoherent and I'm sorry. I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Here we go. An incoherent and metaphysical dualism, right? You have mind and body, extended body and mind. Or it's an abstract and wordless ego that cannot sustain or validate its own world. It requires, Descartes is going to require God for that purpose. Or it's just simply a misguided meditation. This is the wrong approach. Descartes wants certainty. Nobody's going to have certainty in this world, so that's just the wrong way to do it. It's an illusion. There's no substantive I behind the I think. The cogito is simply immersed in nature. It is part of the brain, the physiology of the brain. Or it's been deconstructed by Heidegger. So there are all these arguments against the cogito. And I thought, you know what? I just want to advocate for the cogito. I want to speak on behalf of the cogito. And that's how this kind of came about, this paper that I wrote. So no matter how much you attack the cogito or the cogito is attacked, that's okay. It's okay with the cogito because the cogito has a secret, the Cartesian secret. But the question is how best to reveal this secret. What's the best journey? What's the best path to take us on this journey to the cogito? We know the one that Descartes has taken. His is a very personal, it's a private and subjective meditation. It's called first meditations. But Descartes, Descartes was a rigorous thinker. He was much, the guy's a genius. Not like us mere mortals. I mean, this is a very arduous and very disciplined approach and personal approach that Descartes is taking. But we want to avoid that. We want to avoid talk about beliefs and doubts and certainty, because how can I be certain that my certainty is the same as your certainty? Or how can I be guaranteed that my own self-reflections duplicate and validate Descartes' conviction and certainty? So when he gets all the way down, so maybe this goes back to the question that was asked earlier about intuition. How do I know that my intuition that I think, therefore I am, is actually the same as Descartes' intuition that he thinks that, therefore I am? So that's a problem that we want to overcome. And we're going to do that by recasting the argument in a publicly accessible and universal language. And that language is going to be the language of first order predicate logic, right? That's the logic of quantifiers and predicates. So it is a symbolically expressing the cogito argument in terms of logical expressions. Sorry, just a second. Okay. So, an unexpected beginning. So we want to go on this path. We're going to go on a path of using logic to capture Descartes' ideas. And here we are with our very first logical expression that we're going to talk about. And I said I would give you an example of how I want to, how I think you should approach this, each one of these statements. So the format that I'm going to give, this is the principle of sufficient reason. And this is the Stanford Encyclopedia's version of this principle. I figure they have a better authority than I do. So, but let's just take a look at this, and you can see that the first thing is there's the name, the principle of sufficient reason. And then in parentheses, we have the acronym PSR, or I'm going to call that the logical name. The logical name of the principle of sufficient reason is the PSR. Below that, we have the logical expression, but do not look at that right now. And then we'll have an English version. Everything has a reason or a cause. And finally, below that, there's a formal definition of that particular expression. So what I want you to do, each time that a new expression comes up, read the name, take note of the logical name, the PSR, and read the English description of it. And then what's going to happen, and this is especially true for people who are just not real familiar with this type of notation. I think this will just help you make it a lot easier. But then I'm going to read out loud the formal definition of the expression. And while I'm doing that, I don't want you to read the English that I'm reading. I want you to read the expression itself. Draw your attention to those symbols. And so then I will read that expression out loud. So here we have, so that's kind of the format that I think you should do when these things come up. So, and again, just take them one at a time. Don't try to hold on to them. Just take them one at a time. So the principle of sufficient reason is the name of this. It's called the PSR. That's the logical name. In English, it means everything has a reason or a cause. Formally, and if you just look at the notation as I read this, for all x, there exists a y such that y is a sufficient reason for x. I'm sorry. I have to move this. Okay. I've got my screen kind of just in the way, thanks. Okay. So for all x, there exists a y such that y is a sufficient reason for x. So we're just starting here. This is called a categorical statement. It's a statement, which means it's true or false. So we're not going to try to litigate this statement. We're not. It is an obvious and compelling statement. It seems to be obviously true. People that hold this statement as true generally think or assert that this statement is known a priori. We know it in advance. I know that everything has a reason. I don't have to go looking for a reason. In fact, if I don't know the reason, I assume that there's a reason there. So this is taken as a first principle that not only is true, but it's necessarily true. And as necessarily true, it's inconceivably false. Now we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. But that's kind of people who take this to be true see it as necessarily true. There are ambiguities in this, however. We don't know what x is, and we don't have a definition for what a sufficient reason is. And so that's something that we want to solve. Okay, so here's the next logical expression. And like I say, let's just take a look at the name, the principle of existence. And the logical name for that is the PE. And we are basically restating the principle of sufficient reason. In English, for all things that exist, there is a sufficient reason they exist. Let me just take a side moment here to mention, so the principle of existence, I came up with this expression and I got to name it because I'm the author. And that was one of the real treats of writing this paper, was I came up with these expressions and named them. And so I call this one the principle of existence. I would recommend everybody just, take up writing. If you're going to do philosophy, I would really recommend that you write philosophy. I think it really makes a huge difference. Let's read this formally then. For all x, again, keep your eyes on the equation itself. For all x in the set of things that exist x, there exists a reason r in the set of reasons r, such that r is a sufficient reason for x. So for all x for all x in the set of things that exist x, uppercase x is the class of all things that exist. Uppercase r is a class of all the reasons. And then we have r is a sufficient reason for x. So this is a restatement of the PSR. So the PSR is equivalent to the PE. And here you can see that expressed logically as an equivalence, where the original PSR is equivalent to the PE. What we've done here is just added an explicit domain of discourse, all things that exist and the reasons. And also, we want to disentangle reasons from cause. A cause is something that happens in the world. A bowling ball, something that exists in the world, knocks down a bunch of pins, which exist in the world. But the reason is a statement or a proposition that asserts that the bowling ball is the cause of knocking down the pins. The one thing that's about this is existence implies sufficiency. We almost don't even have to give a reason. We don't have to give a definition of sufficient reason, precisely because if something exists, well, it must have a reason. So we're kind of absolved of having to actually come up with what a sufficient reason can be. I need to fix something here, just a second. Okay. Great. So I said that we're going to, the first part of this session is to pick up some logical tools. After we've done that, then we're going to turn our attention to Descartes' Cogito argument. But we need these logical tools in order to get there. So the first one is the law of excluded middle, where there are three laws of thought: the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. The law of excluded middle simply says that a proposition must be either true or false. So when we take the principle of existence, or because it's equivalent, the principle of sufficient reason, that statement must be true or false. Well, what would make the statement false? A lot of people might suggest, well, God would be an example. God is an example of something which does not need a reason. He is a kind of being which is its own reason. He's a necessary being. Another example might be, well, just the universe or just some brute fact is all that's necessary. So even if we do not know, and I don't know, even if we do not know what would make the principle of existence or the principle of sufficient reason false, we can express that as a logical equation. So this is what this does. The negation of the principle of existence. Oh. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I keep my hands off the mouse here. The negation of the principle of existence. So in English, it says a principle of existence is false if there is something that has no reason for existing, right? So we don't even know what that is, but this would make it false. And if we're going to read this in the formal way of reading this, and again, keep your eyes on the expression up there, the negation of the PE is equivalent to there is an X in the set of things that exist X for all R in the set of reasons R, such that R is not a sufficient reason for X. So that little symbol, that little square symbol is a not sign. So this is a formal expression of a counterexample. So this is part of the tools that we need to pick up. If we have a categorical statement, no matter what it is, the negation of that statement would be an existential statement. And that's what the negation of the principle of existence is, an existential statement. This is a simple concept. I mean, if I were to claim all cats are black, well, all you need to do is point out an instance of a cat that's not black, and that would be the negation of that statement. Okay. One of the things that's very important that we do here is we need to come up with a formal definition for a sufficient reason. And by a formal definition of a sufficient reason, I mean that we need to have a logical equation. That's what this is all about. We need a logical equation for the definition of sufficient reason. In order to get there, we want to take a look at what it is that makes a reason in the first place. And so my claim here is that reasons have two parts. There's an existential claim, and there's a reason for that claim. So an existential claim, the form of a reason, in other words, is X exists because of reason R. So here's an example. The Space Needle exists. That is an existential claim, or what I'm going to call the assertion of existence. The Space Needle exists because of some reason. The organizers wanted to create an iconic symbol for the 1962 World's Fair. So every reason is of this form. So this is important that we focus in on this, that we remember this assertion of existence is part of a reason for something existing. It's for this reason that I say reasons are intentional. It's just the way I think about it. Intentionality is a phenomenological concept. Usually it's described in terms of consciousness is intentional because consciousness is always consciousness of something else. It's always consciousness of something beyond itself, refers to something else. Here, a reason is always a reason for something. A reason, I can't think of a reason that's just standing alone, simply an assertion. The organizers wanted to create an iconic symbol for the 1962 World's Fair in Seattle. That's a proposition, but it's not a reason because it's not a reason for anything. It's not till you apply the existential claim, the Space Needle exists, and make that's the reason for it. So you need both pieces of that. But when is enough enough? So let's talk about sufficient reasons. A sufficient reason seems to require an epistemic adequation. We have to have knowledge of why that is the reason. And there's also something of psychological satisfaction involved with this. Let me take a look at my notes here. So The concept seems somewhat nebulous, and it depends on its context of whether or not a reason is sufficient, and it depends on the person, depends on subjectively whether or not they're satisfied. Now, these two are different, but they're sort of tied together. So think, for instance, of a physicist. If we said, why does the sun exist, right? Well, the sun exists because billions and billions of years ago, there was a supernova explosion, which caused the contraction of a huge gas and dust that contracted to create a cluster of stars. And one of those stars was the sun. And that's the reason why the sun exists. The sun exists, the assertion of claim, and then the reason why. If you're a physicist, however, that's not good enough. You need probably, you're going to want equations, right? You're going to want equations to give you precise reason why the sun exists. If you're like me, and all you want to do is watch it on YouTube, and you get an artist rendition of the sun, of this supernova explosion and the sun coming, and that's psychologically satisfying to me, and I'm good with that. But we're still left with this it's vagary, right? It's not clear, it's not enough. One of the things that we could do would be to take and sharpen our definition of sufficient reason, and we could apply it to different domains of discourse, so that for the scientific domain, we could have a particular kind of sufficient reason, another one, which in fact they do for legal reasons, sufficient reasons, or for everyday discourse, which, anything goes in everything discourse. So we have this idea of sufficient reason, but it's still kind of fuzzy. We need something better.
Say, Dennis, do you take questions now, or do you want us to wait?
I'm going to come to a portion where I'm going to review, okay, these tools before we go on to Descartes. So let's just wait until I get to that, okay, which is coming up here in a second. Is that good?
Yeah, fine.
All right, so we're looking for a sufficient reason. We're looking for a formal definition of sufficient reason. We can get a clue. This is a clue by looking at the principle of inexistence. So that's the name of this particular expression. The logical name is the PI. In English, for all things that do not exist, there is a sufficient reason they do not exist. So notice that the class is now not X, not uppercase X. And so I'll read the formal definition, and while you guys take a look at the expression itself. For all X in the set of things that do not exist, not X, there exists a reason R in the set of reasons R such that R is a sufficient reason for not X. So some things don't exist. Palm trees in Antarctica don't exist. Cities on the moon don't exist. Unicorn tears don't exist. There's a reason for that. There's a sufficient reason for palm trees not existing in Antarctica. The climate is not good for palm trees, right? They require a tropical climate, although there are palm tree fossils in Antarctica. There's also a reason for that, but there are no cities on the moon. We don't have the technology to put cities on the moon. Unicorn tears, unicorns never cry, so there's no such thing as unicorn tears. These ideas gives us a reason for something to not exist, but those reasons are contingent, right? They're just merely contingent reasons. They're not necessary reasons that they don't exist. We are making this journey towards the Cogito in the spirit of Descartes, and so we need something much more certain. We need something that's much clearer. So now we're going to go to our next statement, and this is the principle of inexistent objects, the PIO. So I guess you guys are beginning to see I'm presenting these logical expressions one after the other. And again, we're still in the phase of this where we're just looking at our logical tools that we're going to come up with here. So in English, this says, for all things that do not exist, if the assertion of existence X is a contradiction, then that is a sufficient reason X did not exist. So let's take a look at this statement. This statement is a conditional statement. If P, then Q. If X and not X, right? Let me just go ahead and read the formal definition. while you look at, well, again, while you're looking at the symbols, for all X in the set of things that do not exist, there exists a reason R in the set of reasons R, such that if X and not X, then R is a sufficient reason for not X, where X and not X is the assertion of the existence of X. So this says that if you try to assert the existence of an object, and that assertion is a contradiction, then that is a sufficient reason that object does not exist. I think we need an example. We need an example for this. So what's a sufficient reason? We know four-sided triangles do not exist. Married bachelors do not exist. Round squares do not exist. Those are things that do not exist, just like unicorn tears and cities on the moon. We take a look at the assertion of existence. It would be married bachelors exist because of some reason R. So if you're going to supply a sufficient reason why something doesn't exist, that sufficient reason must be of the form X because R. And in this case, marriage bachelors exist because of some reason R. But marriage bachelors is a contradiction. It's the same as saying there exists an X, such that X is married and X is a bachelor. But that's equivalent to saying that X is married and X is not married, because the definition of bachelor is to be not married, an unmarried man. Because that is a contradiction, then married bachelors cannot exist. So that is in itself, the necessity of inexistence is sufficient for inexistence. So this definition of sufficient reason is a formal definition. It's the PIO. It's a formal definition for sufficient reason of inexistent objects. So this just gives us an idea of kind of thing we're looking for. It is a logical equation. It's a conditional statement, but it's not complete, because it only tells us about those things that if the assertion of existence is a contradiction, it doesn't tell us about anything. It doesn't tell us about unicorn tears, for instance. So this kind of takes us, I believe this takes us to our first stopping point here. And just to keep track that we are on, oops, I gotta let somebody into the group here. We are on a journey to the cogito. That journey that we are taking is going to use logical expressions in order to get there. Doesn't seem like we're talking about the cogito much, but that's where we're going. We now know that there are such things as categorical statements, statements about class of things, that statement, because they're statements, they can be true or false. That the negation, these are the things that you remember. The negation of a categorical statement is an existential statement. That is, all you need to have is a counterexample, a single counterexample. We need to be aware what we're trying to do and what we want to accomplish. In order to capture Descartes' cogito argument, we are going to require a formal definition, a logical expression of sufficient reason. So that's one of our requirements. And we have to be aware of this idea of the assertion of existence, the form that a reason takes. And finally, we have the example of a PIO as a formal, necessary, but incomplete definition of sufficient reason. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and then we can take some questions. Anybody?
Yeah, question. The reason why palm trees don't grow in the North Pole is because the climate's bad.
Right.
That's a contingent reason. It's a if climate changed, you could grow palm trees, and in fact, as you say, they used to be grown there. The reason why married bachelors don't exist is because it's a contradiction in terms. One of those reasons is a causal reason. One of them is a formal, logical reason. But you seem to be conflating those. In other words, you're looking for things that don't exist, unicorn tears. Well, if there were unicorns, which is not a logical contradiction, there could be unicorns. If there were, they could have tears. So it's not a logical contradiction to say that there are no unicorn tears. You see what I'm saying? There's
that's not a contradiction, but that is a sufficient reason. So I'm not equating them. I'm just there are two types. Some reasons are contingent. Some reasons are necessary. So I don't want to conflate and say that they're both the same, but they're both sufficient. I think it's a sufficient reason to say the climate is not good enough in the art.
Okay, so you have two categories of sufficient reasons: one logical and
one necessary. And we're Cartesians.
The logical one is the one that's necessary.
Yes.
And you have another one that's just contingent. Well, there doesn't happen to be a climate that's suitable for growing palm trees in Antarctica, so they don't.
Yes. And like I say, we are here today, we are all Cartesians. And because we're Cartesians, contingent reasons aren't going to be good enough for us. We want necessary reasons, right? And we'll talk about Descartes' project here a little bit too. People cannot join the way it's set up, is that right?
No, Dennis, what I was saying is I think most people can join, but when I tried to log on, it said you needed to log in with your email. So you either need like a Gmail account or like a Zoom account. So someone messaged me and said they didn't have those, so they can't log in.
Oh, sorry.
But I think that's where you set it up. Like, you know, like you need to put your email in. If you don't have like a Zoom account, you can't log in. So a bunch of people probably couldn't log in, but I think it's too late now. Probably it was just set up that way.
This is the first time that I've set up a Zoom meeting. I wasn't sure about some things. I'm glad we got this many people online here today.
What would be a good reason? So I have a question. So
sure.
What would be a reason to prevent the existence of gold mountains? So gold mountains seems to be something that is possible. It's conceivable. It's not logically prohibited. And it might also be something that is in a logically possible world. Like in the words of David Lewis, it might be one of the possible world in which there is a gold mountain. So what is a reason? What is a sufficient reason to preclude that from happening in this actual world? Because it's not logical, right? It's not formal.
Right, it's not logical. It's contingent. There could be gold mountains. Maybe something. If you ever watch the show Gold Rush, some of those mountains seem to be gold mountains. Yeah, it's a contingent reason. It's not a logical contradiction to say gold mountains exist, right? We can assert the existence. Gold mountains exist because, for some reason, whatever that reason you want to give, then you would have to argue why that reason is sufficient. But there's nothing to preclude. It's not a contradiction to assert that gold mountains exist. It would be a contradiction to assert that gold mountains exist and gold mountains don't exist. But yeah, there's nothing to preclude it. So it's not necessarily the case that gold mountains exist or don't exist.
Well, but it seems to me that there is no sufficient reason for why gold mountain doesn't exist in the current world. It's logically possible that the gold mountain exists. It exists in the current world, but it's just contingently so that it doesn't exist. So
right.
This is not. There are something that doesn't have any sufficient reason for it.
Well, there's a sufficient reason that gold mountains don't exist because there's only so much gold in the crust of the earth, right? So in order to have that a golden mountain, you would need to have enough gold all in one place in order to get a gold mountain. So I think there's a reason that it could exist. There could be some planet in the universe somewhere. Gold is created in actually in supernovas, right? There could be some place where it's concentrated so much that the whole planet is made of gold. I wouldn't preclude that as necessarily not happening, but so I think that's a sufficient reason it's possible. Not likely, not probable, but yeah, I wouldn't exclude it on logical grounds. So the point I think I try to make here is that what Descartes wants is logical necessity. That's what he wants. And a contingent reason or sufficient reason is not good enough, not going to be good enough. Anybody else? David?
Yeah, so without being able to really anticipate exactly where we're going, but it's so far so good. Actually, so far I have accumulate a certain doubt or uncertainty about what to do with this language. So what are the possible things? How are we supposed to treat the things in this language? What can we substitute in this algebra for the capital letters as either the sets or the relations, if they're kind of conceptual to begin with, so that there's no particular guarantee what you and I are thinking or the boundaries of that? I mean, you know, does the number 3 exist? Does my coffee cup, does my dream, did that exist? You know, so with this degree of sort of vagueness to my idea of what I can substitute in, I'm not sure where I'm going to get with the language, because it's going to repeat what I'm, you know, it's going to repeat what it repeats.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a slide on that question, exactly on that question, right? What is the what are the things that exist? So we're going to get to that here in a minute. So can you just, if you hold off on that for just a bit, we will get there.
Have you handled then already on a previous slide?
No, not really, not explicitly.
The same question for what does it mean to be a reason of?
Say that again now.
So have you already handled the question I'm asking for, you know, how do we use this algebra for the meaning of what is a reason of, like are used to mean the reason of, what does that relationship actually specifically mean?
It asserts a sufficient reason for something to be. So, like I said, why does the sun exist? The reason is a statement. The supernova is a fact or an object or something that happened in the world. So the reason is talking about. The reason is true or false. It's a proposition. And it is given as a reason why the existential claim is true. So it is a reason for asserting the truth value of the claim X exists.
So when you say there was a supernova as a sufficient reason, you need the supernova, and then you need all the assumptions of modern physics and the use of estimates and logic and mathematics and solar estimates of convection and the properties of fluids in order to fully substantiate that as an explanation, right?
Absolutely. And that's why Descartes, that's why we're not going to be able to use that version of sufficient reason. It's because it's always open. You can always require more. You can always say, okay, you gave me this reason why, but that's not good enough. I want more. And so you give more. And then the person says, well, that's still not good enough. I need all these other assumptions. I need to have a full understanding. When does it ever end? It doesn't, right? So it's never good enough. So that's what we want to avoid. We want to come up with something that's going to be good enough. So that's why that slide said, when is enough enough? Well, maybe never. Not when you're doing that way, when you're trying to give a positive response to what a sufficient reason is. So I've got some more questions here. Ken.
Sort of jumped off from Philip's comment of the gold mountain and a little bit of Dave. In all these statements, the existential claim is just stated, and then we're talking about the sufficient reason and whether the reason is sufficient, complete, or not. But it leaves the existential claim just naked out there. So the gold mountain, you know, there's nothing to say whether that exists or not. It's like you make a statement and then you see if there's sufficient reason. And maybe there is sufficient reason for a gold mountain to exist, but we just don't know it. But it seems like in all of this, there's an assumption of the existence of something. And then the open question of is there a sufficient claim, but it doesn't really help us prove if that existence is actual.
If you're going to provide a sufficient reason for something, you have to assert it. I'm not asserting it. Somebody's going to assert a reason. I'm going to assert, or I can assert, the sun exists because I'm not assuming that all this stuff exists. I'm just saying that this is an assertion
Right.
that the sun exists. And the question is, I'm not particularly concerned about whether it does exist. I want to know if there's a sufficient reason for that or not.
Okay. Well, I was looking at, well, maybe I'll wait
So,
to see where you
well,
take it.
again, yeah, so it's very easy, and I find myself falling into it, but I do want to always try to disentangle the statements, the propositions from the things. And we
Okay.
want to stay up on the level of the language, because I think that's actually where the cogito resides as well.
Well, and the only reason I brought it up is, and maybe I should have waited to see where you're going with this, but the existential claim is at the I in the cogito, and so then you end up with the, you know, how do you know that there's an I to make that statement? And maybe that's I'll just leave that, and you can do wherever you're taking.
We're gonna end up there.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah, so
we're gonna
anyway.
go. We're gonna go there.
All right, thanks.
Okay, one more. Then I gotta get moving on. Anybody else?
Yes, Dennis. When you talk about the sun exists, the reason for the sun existing is because there was a supernova and all kinds of physical stuff happened and so forth. That reason has to do with physical causes. You say the reason
that reason speaks of physical causes.
speaks of physical causes.
The reason is the proposition.
Let me finish.
Okay, sorry.
The reason why there's a Space Needle in Seattle, I mean, there's a number of physical causes, but what you said was because some architects or somebody wanted a nice symbol. That's not a physical cause. That's a statement about somebody's intention, somebody's wants and desires and so forth. There's two different categories of things. Sun exists because there's physical causes did such and such. Space Needle exists because somebody got an idea in their head and convinced a bunch of people to build it. That's in addition to all the physical causes, you know, concrete and whatever.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's why I talk about the contextual and subjective nature of sufficient reasons. The sufficient reason is entirely determined about what it is you're concerned about. Are you concerned about the physical who built the thing? What's the general contractor who built it? Or are you talking about the planners of the World's Fair?
So there are various categories of reasons.
Right. So you have all these different categories of reasons, and what is adequate in one is not at all adequate in another. And you can never quite, you know, tie this all up in a bow and just be, and it's adequate for all at all times. And that's what we want. That's what we're looking for. So I'm going to move on now to.
So
thank you for your questions. Yeah, Philip, did you have something?
yeah, I have one more question.
Okay.
Well, there's some comments on in the chat, but you can look at it. But my question is this: so suppose that every single thing has a reason for existing. There's a reason for it being the way it is. And suppose that that's the case. Does it follow that the universe itself have a reason? Is the universe a thing? Is the universe, is the whole universe something that with reason? And is that reason part of the universe or outside of the universe?
Yeah. Do you want to assert that the universe has a reason? You know, we can assert that a lot of things have a reason. Some people will say, well, the universe is a special kind of thing, and I'm not going to try to give it a reason. There's no way I can give a reason to the universe. It just is. So when I start talking about things that have reasons, I stop. I'm not talking about me personally. I'm talking about people who make this claim. They'll say, we just need to stop it at the universe because we're not going to give a reason for it. The universe, in that case, would be a counterexample to the principle of sufficient reason, right? It would be an instance of a brute fact, and that says that the principle of sufficient reason is false. That's what's important. That's what important for me is what makes the principle of sufficient reason, which is the same as the principle of existence, what makes it false? Well, a counterexample would make that false. And if you may be claiming that the universe has no reason, then if that's true, then that is a counterexample. And if it's a counterexample, then the principle of sufficient reason is false. So it's a logical relationship.
I wouldn't say that principle of sufficient reason is false there, or that you've proved it in any way. It just depends on your own cosmological theory. And the problem is you'd have to go, if you assume that it's a cyclical universe of some kind, you can never find the sufficient reason, because you have to keep kicking the metaphysical can down the road and say, why does the universe initially come into existence? We could explain with sufficient reason, perhaps, why what we see as the observable universe came into existence, but we cannot, because we do not have a theory of everything. We do not even have a gut theory. We do not know really we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. We can't answer the question of how the universe came into existence, but many in cosmology answer the question as to why our observable universe came into existence, as opposed to the universe.
The principle of sufficient reason says everything has a reason. That's what it says. Everything has a reason. The question is that true or false? Well, what you're explaining there is, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a reason for the universe and it keeps going back and we don't know it. But the question, the ultimate question is this true or false? And the only way to show that it's false, right, is to negate it. And you negate it with a counterexample. That is the point, that you negate I've got somebody waiting, coming in. You negate a universal statement with the counterexample. Now, you may or may not be able to give that counterexample. And if you can't give it, you may want to say, well, I told you, everything has a reason. Let's move on, because we're going to apply all this.
Sorry, just one very quick question.
Sure.
You're saying that, can we say that the universe is a domain and it's not a thing in the domain? Then is it a counterexample if you talk about the domain that is a set of the things that has a reason? We don't need to say that the set in itself has a reason. So it's not a counterexample if the set doesn't have a reason.
I would agree that if it's outside the domain that you're talking about, that you specified, then it would not be a counterexample, right? It wouldn't be a counterexample. I would agree with that.
I'm still bothered by the causes versus deliberate intention. You could say the universe doesn't have, we don't know why the universe exists. It just exists, a brute fact, and there's no causal reason why it exists, and so forth. That's a contradiction. It contradicts the principle of sufficient reason. Or you could say, the universe exists because God wanted a universe, so God made one. That's a reason why. It might be a true or false reason, I don't know, but it's a reason for the universe existing. But it's a completely different category. And I'm worried that you're jumbling up these two categories under the rubric reason. One of the categories is a physical cause, one of them is a deliberate intention, and it gets very, very muddy.
Okay, so if God made it for a reason, then the universe is not a counterexample to the claim that everything has a reason.
Correct.
And that's the point I'm making. Just that. I don't really want to go off and discuss whether or not the universe has a reason. All I want to know is I have a claim, a universal claim, and then I have some other existential claim. Does that count? Does that a counterexample to and show that a universal claim is false? That's the important relationship there. I'm going to move on now, because now we're going to get into Descartes. Okay. Now, all right, so we might as well start here. Nothing exists. Nothing exists. So here's a new equation. It's called the principle of possibility. The logical name is PP. And this statement, and I'm not making a judgment. This is a claim. Somebody's making this claim. Every one of these expressions make a claim that's true or false. Let's take a look at what this one claims. This one claims that for all things that exist, there's a sufficient reason that they do not exist. Okay, and I'll read that as a formal logical expression. And remember, keep your eyes on the symbols. For all x in the set of things that exist x, there's a reason r in the set of reasons r, such that r is a sufficient reason for not x. If you notice that this particular equation is exactly like the principle of existence, except we're talking about not x instead of x. It's the only really difference there. So this is a very interesting assertion. You know, just think of this as, think you're at a dinner party, right? And somebody says, hey, for all things that exist, there's a sufficient reason they do not exist. Now we want to be clear about what this thing is saying, what this statement says. This is not about contingency and it's not about finitude. It's not saying that there's a reason that the Earth may someday not exist, right? The reason might be, we're using astronomical examples here. The reason might be that the sun is going to expand into a red giant, right, and take over the orbit of the Earth, and the Earth is going to disappear. And so that's a reason why the Earth may someday in the future not exist. It's also not a claim that way back billions of years ago, there were some special conditions in the solar system that caused the Earth to come into existence, that the Earth is contingent. It's not making either one of those two claims. It's making an entirely different claim. It is making an utterly nihilistic claim that basically nothing exists, that what you think exists, the computer in front of you, the table, the desk, whatever it is around you, doesn't exist. The people you're talking to don't exist. That is an interesting claim, the principle of possibility. So this is my first expression in trying to capture Descartes' argument. So this is the first assertion. It's not saying that, I'm not saying that Descartes asserted this. I'm not trying to read Descartes and then do a formal representation of his arguments, but I'm trying to capture the kind of the essence of his logical argument. Do you know what? I accidentally skipped. I'm sorry. I skipped a page. So I want to go back here because we need to talk about the Cartesian project here. I think skipping a page is okay. What is his project? His project is to overcome skepticism, right? And he's going to do that by applying skepticism in a really radical way. His methodology of universal doubt is a radical way of applying skepticism to the world. Up until the time of Descartes, right, we have this holy trinity, Plato, Aristotle, and Christianity. But that is starting to break apart. The natural sciences are coming in, people like Galileo, and the ideas about the world are starting to change. Particularly, Aristotle is susceptible to this because of those three, he's the one who wrote about the natural world. And so his ideas are starting to break down. So there's a lot of skepticism. And Descartes wants to fight against this skepticism, and he does it in a unique way by applying skepticism in a radical way to show that it's false. So he's going to do that using these different arguments. There's the argument from illusion, the dream argument, and the evil genius argument. Now, my claim here is that these are all basically the same argument, that they all want to show that something doesn't exist. And we saw that on the next slide, right? So he wants to take us and show, for instance, he starts by saying, well, can we trust the senses? Well, sometimes we have illusions, so let's not trust the senses at all. I am particularly not interested in that question, right? I don't want to get bogged down in this question of what's really real or not. We're just looking at the logical idea here that's behind this question. The dream argument is the same thing. If we're having a dream, as we're having the dream, we think it's real. We can't distinguish the dream from reality. Last night I had a dream. I was giving this presentation and I was standing in front of a whiteboard and somebody gave me a white magic marker. And I just looked at it like I wasn't sure what to do with it. But the white magic marker didn't exist. The whiteboard didn't exist. None of that existed. So there was an apparent reality, when in fact, it didn't exist at all. The evil genius argument, I believe, is actually a much more interesting argument. And I would have a lot to say about the evil genius argument, but for us, for this purposes right here, right now, it really just expresses in a universal way what the argument from illusion and the dream argument is that reality isn't really real. Reality is apparent. Reality doesn't really exist, right? We just think it does. We just think that it exists. So the question is, how can we capture this using a logical expression? So again, I'm not really interested in getting bogged down in this question. I think that's kind of a mistake when people approach Descartes. These are interesting questions in themselves. You know, how much should we trust illusions? You know, the dream argument's interesting. Like I say, there's things to say about the evil genius argument, but I think it takes us away from the real argument that Descartes is making, which I'm hoping to show in using these expressions. So like I say, we have the principle of possibility. Now, just quickly to go over it again, for all things that exist, there's a sufficient reason they do not exist. So if you have an illusion that you see a lake off in the distance, the lake you think is real, but it's illusion, there's a sufficient reason to think that, oh, it doesn't exist, right? So it's only apparently existing. And when you apply this in a universal way, you end up with an utterly nihilistic proposition: nothing exists at all. Well, if nothing exists, that means everything is at stake. So show me. So I'm from Missouri. The motto of Missouri, the state of Missouri, is show me. Missouri has changed significantly since I lived there many, many, many years ago. It's gone off in a wholly different direction, but I stick with the motto, show me. So if the PP is true, if the principle of possibility is true, the world we live in is false. It's entirely false. It's not a true world. It's like living in a dream. But if it is false, then we should be able to demonstrate that it's true, that it's false, right? We should be able to show that this statement, we should be able to show that the principle of possibility is false. We know the principle of possibility is a categorical statement. We know how to show a categorical statement is false by negating it. When we negate it, we end up with an existential statement, which is a counterexample to the principle of possibility. We don't know what that counterexample is, but that's what we're looking for. So here we have the negation of the principle of possibility, not PP. In English, the principle of possibility is false. If something exists, again, it's a conditional statement, right? If then P, if P then Q, if there's no reason for it to not exist. Formally, we can say this as the negation of the PP is equivalent to their existent X in the set of things that exist X, such that for all R in the set of reasons R is not a sufficient reason for not X. So these are getting a little complicated, but basically just saying there's a reason that there's no reason for something to not exist. So here is, I've got this starred in my notes. This captures Descartes' methodology. Descartes' methodology of universal doubt is meant to test the truth value of the principle of possibility. Is the principle of possibility true or false? That's what we're interested in. And in order to do that, we need a counterexample. We're going to come back to this in a minute. We're going to get to this question. I forget who it was who asked about this. So what the heck exists? What exists? Well, geez, what exists? People have been talking about that for thousands of years. We want to populate the existence of the set of things that exist. I want to make sure that I don't skip anything here. Okay, so we want to populate this class of things that exist, uppercase X. What exists and what what criteria do we use to populate this? Well, fortunately, we don't have to decide. It's already been decided for us. We will accept everything and anything. We'll put everything into this class, whatever it is. Our criteria for putting it in is, did somebody claim it's true? Does three exist? Put it in there. Does Bigfoot exist? Yes, even put Bigfoot in there. Put everything in there. If we were to take a survey of everybody in a Zoom meeting right now and say, okay, everybody, write down all the things that exist, we would have all this disagreement. If we were to ask everybody in the world what exists, oh my gosh, we would have disaster. We would have a mess. We'd have so many different things. But guess what? As far as we're not going to make that decision, let's just put everything in. So what is our task? Our task is to find a counterexample to the principle of possibility, to show that that statement is false. We want to demonstrate that statement is false. So if we put Bigfoot in, we can then say, well, is there a sufficient reason that Bigfoot does not exist? Well, I think there are sufficient reasons that Bigfoot does not exist. And if there are sufficient reasons Bigfoot does not exist, then Bigfoot is not a counterexample to the principle of possibility. Bigfoot does not prove that it's false, right? We need to find something else to prove that the principle of possibility is false, because that's what we're doing. We're just testing. We're just going to go down the list of all these things that are in the class of things that exist and say, can we provide a sufficient reason for it to not to exist? And if we can, like we did for Bigfoot, then it's not a counterexample. There's an interesting thing about this, though, that I just want to mention, because you could ask, well, wait a minute, if we're going to decide that Bigfoot doesn't exist, then he shouldn't be in the class in the first place. So yeah, the criteria in this case becomes like, do we apply it on the front end and just not populate our class with Bigfoot? Or do we put it in there and then test? So I'm choosing to put it all in there, and then we're going to test. And in fact, I'm not even sure I want to throw it out. All I want to do is, I'm not going to say Bigfoot doesn't exist. All I'm going to say is Bigfoot, the only claim I want to make is Bigfoot is not a counterexample to prove that the principle of possibility is false. That's the only claim I really want to make. So just like we had it, yes.
And then, do I see some kind of relationship between Karl Popper's falsifiability here?
I hadn't thought about that. Yes, but you're right. You're exactly right. This is because when in science, you are making general claims, right? You are making a universal claims. The falsifiability for Karl Popper is that there must be a possibility of knowing whether or not it's true or false, right? You can't simply make the claim God exists and have no possibility that it can never accept any reason why it doesn't. But it is a general claim, and there has to be something that proves that it's false. You have to accept that possibility that something could demonstrate it's false. And so the form of that would be the negation of that claim, which is the existential claim, or the counterexample.
In that case, my next question is then how is it possible to answer Bigfoot does or does not exist? Because it's at the end, it's the same question with the does God exist? You cannot falsify that. So Bigfoot, is it different in God case?
So we are interested in determining is there a sufficient reason for asserting the claim Bigfoot does not exist? Well, I think there are plenty of reasons why I would want to assert the claim Bigfoot does not exist is true. And I can give a bunch of reasons, and then one would be, well, if Bigfoot did exist, then we would have a fossil record of Bigfoot. We would have hunters who go out there and who would have killed Bigfoot. We would have bodies of Bigfoot. We would see Bigfoot on trail cameras. There's a lot of reasons to think that Bigfoot does not exist. I would claim that, one, there is a sufficient reason that Bigfoot does not exist. And then if there is a sufficient reason Bigfoot does not exist, then we cannot use Bigfoot to undermine the principle of possibility, because that's what we want to do. We want to show the principle is false. So Bigfoot's not a good example. It doesn't work for us, right? Because we can give a good reason why he doesn't exist. Now, you might say, well, I've got a lot of reasons why he does exist, right? I've got, cast of feet and that kind of thing. But my argument is that I can provide sufficient reason. Now, we can go back and forth whether or not sufficient reason is good enough, but I think we can provide a reason why he does exist. For Descartes, if there's a question there, is a sufficient reason good enough? Well, that's not good enough for Descartes because it's not necessary. It doesn't give a necessary reason. He needs something stronger, and that's what we're going to be looking for, something stronger.
Hey, Dennis, I'm sorry, but why do you call that thing a principle of possibility? That's the thing, is for all the things that exist, there's a reason that it doesn't exist. Why do you call that a principle possibility? I'm confused.
Well, it's because it's possible that it's true or false, that something exists. It is really just the mere possibility of that it could be true or false, that it may or may not exist.
Okay, for all things that exist, there's a reason that they don't exist.
Right. And that's making the claim that there's a possibility that it doesn't exist. Yes.
Oh, but it's not saying it's possible that they don't exist. You're saying there's a reason that they don't exist.
I'm not saying that. That's what the claim is saying, right? The claim this is an assertion.
Yeah.
That there is a possibility that nothing exists. That's that claim. Well, and so we want to try to show that claim is false.
For everything that exists, there is a reason for its non-existence.
Right.
Have I stated that right?
Yes. And so,
but how do you move from that to possibility? First you say for everything that exists, then there's a reason that it doesn't exist. I just don't get the possibility part. I mean, we could skip this. I'm wondering why you give that name, principle of possibility, to this very peculiar assertion. For everything that exists, there's a reason it doesn't exist.
I think it's the possibility of truth and falsity. It has to do with truth values. And plus, if you want to know the real truth of it, when I came to that point, I thought, oh, the principle of possibility, that's cool. That's a cool name. So like I say, this is the prerogative of the author to name things. But,
all right, so let's go on. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, just on that, in your earlier example, you said, the Earth exists and there's sufficient reason to say it might not exist in the future, or it might not have existed before. So is that what you're trying to show here? When the existence of X, there's a sufficient reason to believe in some scenarios that X might not exist.
No, might not exist in some future time. Doesn't exist right now.
Okay, so your Earth example was not valid then.
The Earth example was to show you what the statement was not talking about, right? It was not talking about contingent and finite reasons. The Earth example, in terms of this particular, the principle of possibility, says the Earth does not exist right now. I can provide, this statement says the Earth does not exist, and there's a sufficient reason to believe that the Earth, or to assert the Earth does not exist. Let me give you an example. We're all dreaming. You're dreaming. You're in the middle of a dream right now. You dream in the Earth. You actually reside on some other planet. The Earth does not exist right now. There's a possibility that the Earth does not exist. You live on Vulcan. There's no such thing as Earth. That's why this claim is so.
I don't think that reason is sufficient, but here is one. Let us use Descartes' idea of the evil genius. We're on the cusp of arriving at AI. So it is quite possible that we live within a simulation, that there is able to create a simulation that is seamless for each of those beings who think of themselves as conscious beings, but we are actually, our consciousness itself is a simulation, perhaps a simulation of a former state of that species before it became an advanced one that is able to simulate us. So it's quite possible that not only the Earth does not exist, but all of our perceptions of the stars in our immediate vicinity do not exist. That would be a sufficient reason. I think the one you gave, that it's all a dream that we all live on Vulcan, it just sounds not quite sufficient to me.
Again, I agree with you. So the problem of sufficiency for you and for me in that case is one of our contextual and subjective, psychological satisfaction. But you are absolutely right. I do not want to talk about whether we're in a simulation, but if we take the claim, the Earth does not exist, right? There is a sufficient reason. I could provide a sufficient reason. You just provided one. We're living in a simulation. There is no Earth. It's all a simulation. Now, for you, that might be a really good reason. For somebody else, it may not be. So it sounds like this is what the principle of possibility is saying. No matter what statement you come up about something that exists, you can provide an argument, in fact, for all the stars, for the galaxy, for everything, for the universe. It's all a simulation.
On the other hand, the simulation exists, but it's not. But the Earth may not exist, and our immediate vicinity, our star system may not exist, and what we see in the heavens may not exist, but the simulation exists.
Well, the simulation might be simulated, and as far as the evil genius goes, how does the evil genius know that he's not being fooled? How does he know? He could be being fooled by the evil genius. Who knows?
It's simulations all the way down.
It's simulations all the way down.
If he's in a Borges tale, he's not certain that he exists.
That's why I think there's
tale by Borges, he's not certain if he exists.
So this is why I think this statement, the principle of possibility, it seems so absurd, right? It's just absurd. Everything, there's a sufficient reason everything doesn't exist now. When you start thinking about it, oh, wait a minute. There are sufficient reasons why things don't exist, why things that we think exist don't actually exist. So let's continue. This is fun, right? I'm having fun. So we need a rule. To determine what's a sufficient reason for something to not exist. And so now we have the principle of existent objects. Remember, we use the principle of inexistent objects. And by the way, when I say inexistence, I also mean non-existence. Those two terms are just the same. They mean exactly the same thing. I had to decide on one or the other. I decided on inexistent. But so the principle of existent objects, the PEO. I'm going to put all this together for you by the end here. But what does this statement say? We notice, first of all, that it is a conditional statement. For all things that do not exist, for everything that does not exist, for all things that do exist, if the assertion of the inexistence of X is not a contradiction, then that is a sufficient reason X does not exist. So the principle of inexistent object says that if you assert the existence of an object, and that's a contradiction, that tells you why it doesn't exist. This one says, if you assert the inexistence of an object, and that is not a contradiction, then that's a sufficient reason to accept that it doesn't exist. So I'm going to read the formal definition. For all X in the set of things that exist X, there exists a reason R in the set of reasons R, such that if not X and not X, then R is sufficient reason for not X. And then as an addendum, where X and not X is the assertion of inexistence of X. So before we had the assertion of existence, now we have the assertion of the inexistence. So what would be an example of the assertion of the inexistence? The Earth does not exist. The Earth does not exist. Why? I can give a reason, because we're living in a simulation. So the Earth does not exist is an assertion of inexistence. Is that a contradiction? No, it's not a contradiction. Well, if it's not a contradiction, then that's a sufficient, whatever reason you give is a reason that it doesn't exist.
there's something very fishy right in there. You've
Well,
skipped
let's keep going because I think
no, 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 no. Let's stop right here.
Okay.
That phrase in the parens, X and not X, just that little piece of it is a contradiction, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So
So if you assert X and not X, you can easily assert X and not X, but that assertion is false.
yeah.
So if you're saying for all X that in a set of X, such there exists an R and the reasons are such that not false, then there's sufficient reason for not X. That's all you're saying.
Exactly. And guess what? That is hardly a condition at all, right? It's saying it has to be true or false. We're going to talk about that here in a second.
Okay.
We're going to talk. The next slide talks about this. This principle.
Okay, go on.
So let's take a look at this principle of existent objects, the PEO. So I put it back. This is the same one as we just looked at. And so you can see this is a conditional statement. And so a conditional statement has two parts: an antecedent, that's the part in yellow, and then it has the consequent. So the antecedent turns out to be the law of non-contradiction. It is, in fact, the law of non-contradiction. So as long as the assertion of inexistence is in accord with the law of non-contradiction, then that is a sufficient reason for Descartes. That's going to be a sufficient reason for Descartes to say that X does not exist. It's hardly a condition. So I've got a table here. This is me just showing my work in effect, but the law of non-contradiction is equivalent to the law of excluded middle. And the reason I put there, it allows us to say that the assertion of inexistence must be either true or false. That's what it's saying. It must be either true or false.
Wait. I'm sorry. I apologize for being dense here, but
go ahead.
The thing in yellow equates to true. You evaluate that, you get true. It's not the case that X and not X. Okay, so X and not X is a contradiction. That's false. But the negation of that falsity is truth. So all you've got here is something that evaluates the true, implies that there's a reason for not X.
Exactly. So the not X and not X, not X and not X is the assertion of inexistence. So let's take an example.
It's not. No. It doesn't assert inexistence. It asserts both existence, X, and non-existence, not X.
No. It says if. It says if it asserts that X and not X, then it doesn't say that it is. So take an example of the Earth does not exist. That statement is not a contradiction. So if it's not a contradiction, then there is a sufficient reason that Earth does not exist. So Earth does not exist. Is the assertion of inexistence true or false? It has a possibility of being true or false. It's in accord with the law of excluded middle. And that's all that's needed. That's it. That's all that's needed.
Yeah,
it has to be true or false.
But you're not asserting the Earth exists. You're not asserting the Earth doesn't exist. You're asserting both, that the Earth exists, X, and that it doesn't exist, not X.
No, I'm saying if what you're asserting is a contradiction. So what I'm asserting is the Earth does not exist. Is that a contradiction?
No, but that's not what your PEO says. That part in yellow.
The part in yellow says if the assertion of inexistence is not a contradiction. Well, the statement, the Earth does not exist, is not a contradiction.
I'm not following it at all. For every X there in the set of things that exists, there's a reason in the set of reasons, such that if it's not the case that something and not something, then there's a sufficient reason for not X. If it's not the case that X and not X, then there's sufficient reason for X. But it's for any X. For any X in the set of X. So if you let's take the Earth as a thing. If we say, well, if for any X, the Earth, there exists a reason such that if it's not the case that the Earth exists and does not exist, then there's a sufficient reason for the non-existence of the Earth. Now, I'm substituting Earth for X.
Well, if you're going to substitute Earth for X, you would say the Earth exists and the Earth does not exist.
That statement is false.
That statement is false. That statement is a contradiction. So that statement is false. So that statement is the antecedent of a conditional. It's false. So it is vacuously true, right? And we're going to talk about that in a minute.
So that statement, true, it's not the case that something exists and doesn't exist. That statement implies that there's a sufficient reason for it not to exist.
Right.
Why doesn't it also imply there's a sufficient reason for it to exist?
It doesn't say anything about that. So it doesn't say, it's not making that claim.
How about if the Earth exists, but it's an illusion? Because matter in the continuum from the particle to the wave particle to the wave is closer to the wave. I've actually seen a photograph of a photon taken with electrons, and there's no, this is empirical proof that there's no genuine particle nature to the photon, that it leans very, very hard toward the direction of a wave. So all particles are actually waves, and all things, including the Earth, it's simply space with waves in it, and thus it is the illusion of an Earth. The Earth is simply the illusion of the Earth because it's simply space with waves in it.
Well, you started out by saying the Earth exists, but it's an illusion. Well, that's the same as saying the Earth exists and it doesn't exist. So that's a contradiction. So,
but it's not. I've just shown that it's not a contradiction.
Well, the claim that it exists and it doesn't exist is a contradiction.
It doesn't exist as we know it because we do not see into the quantum realm. We do not see all the variations that are going in the quantum realm. We cannot even measure them because of the principle of uncertainty, and because what we refer to as particles are not particles, as far as I can see from the empirical evidence, but rather waves. The Earth exists, but as an illusion of the Earth, as an illusion of solidity. In fact, there are what we refer to as the main states of matter are the absolute rarities. Almost all the matter in the universe is plasma. It's in the stars. It's not solids and liquids and gases.
Sure.
So
what we're not here to litigate that. We're just interested in the form of the statement.
So make X unicorn.
I'm sorry?
So make X unicorn. We're diving into physics of Earth that is really.
So if X is okay, so if X is a unicorn. Let's say if X is a unicorn.
And I have some of the same read as Bill. You can read this. I don't know what this says, because you could say X could be unicorn, and then your statement is unicorn and not unicorn is false. So that antecedent is true, and that you have sufficient reason to believe not unicorn. Or you can make X be not unicorn and prove the same thing. You have sufficient reason for unicorn. So I'm not sure what the purpose of this statement.
We will use unicorns. Unicorns do not exist, right? Unicorns do not exist. So we are asserting the inexistence of unicorns. That's the assertion of inexistence. Unicorns do not exist.
But this statement could easily be used the other way. Say unicorns do exist. There's nothing that put.
So this, if I'm going to go back. So down here at the bottom,
I can prove that unicorns exist, but
hold on. Good. Hold on a second. So where X and not X is the assertion of inexistence of X. That's what X and not X is. It's the innocence.
No. X and not X is not the assertion of inexistence of X.
Yes,
it's the assertion of both the existence and the non-existence. The phrase X and not X asserts both the existence of X and the non-existence of X. Your problem, Dennis, is that if you have a contradiction in your premises, you can prove anything. It's just vacuous.
Yeah, that's my thing too. It seems, I'm not sure what you get out of the purpose of the principle, what benefit or what meaning it has.
I think we'll show you here as we go along.
Okay, maybe we should. In the interest of time,
this is a good discussion.
15 minutes.
This is a good discussion.
Sorry.
Okay.
Something about your language, which is X is an object in big X, which is the set of existing things, right? Or is X a proposition that something exists?
X is a proposition.
Ah, that's the issue. First you
X
talk
is a
about
proposition.
objects.
This is why.
No, that's where you're getting very confused. You're talking about unicorns. A unicorn is not a proposition. The proposition is unicorns exist.
Yes. This is what I've been saying. This is why I said from the very beginning that we want to disentangle language from things. We're talking on the level of language here. These are propositions. There's a proposition: unicorns do not exist. That's not a contradiction. If it's not a contradiction, then there's a reasonable, then there is that is itself a sufficient reason that unicorns do not exist.
Yeah, but in your yellow thing here, what is X? Is X a thing or is it a proposition?
Big X is the set of all statements that are true about existing.
Okay.
It's not the set of existing things. It's a set of propositions that are, you can say, for things that exist. This is a collection of statements. This is very different.
Let's follow Descartes and prove that unicorns exist. Descartes talks about standing at a window and seeing men passing in the street. And then he says, no, he has not seen men passing in the street. What he has seen is hats and coats passing in the street, and that he has inferred the existence of men that he has seen from a distance. So now I'm looking out at a distance, right, at an ungulate. It's a deer, right? A deer that just happens from a certain angle to have a head that resembles that of an equine. And that deer has lost, it's a young deer, and it's lost one of its horns. So it has a single horn coming from its head, but from the distance that I view it, I have the illusion of seeing a unicorn. So the unicorn exists and it does not exist. And the principle of contradiction is violated. I have the illusion of the unicorn and I have my knowledge, for instance, from paleontology of the non-existence of the unicorn. So there you go.
Well, existence and illusion are two separate things. They don't have, they're not the same. Either a unicorn exists or it doesn't exist. Whether you think it exists or not is totally irrelevant to whether they do exist or not. And you can claim they exist or you can claim that they don't exist, and that's different still. I think I want to move on. The thing I want to make about this point, so this is about language, and there are two reasons I bring this up. But one is that the principle of existent object is linked necessarily, intimately to the laws of thought. And that is going to be important. That's important because what that is going to be doing is grounding Descartes' cogito to the laws of thought. So they're intimately tied. So I have this table here. You don't need to go too much into this table, but that's hardly it's a conditional, right? If P, then Q. The converse of that would be if Q, then P. A biconditional is the same as P if and only if Q, which is a conjunction that if P is Q, I'm sorry, if P is true, then Q is true, and if Q is true, then P is true. So this is some logical background. So the very right-hand column of that, it uses double arrow, P if and only if Q, and you can see that they're true. It's true. This statement is true both when P is true and Q is true, and when P is false and Q is false. In other words, they're equivalent. So where before in the principle of inexistence, we just have a conditional statement, here we're going to move on to the next statement, which is a definition of sufficient reason. So this is my definition of sufficient reason for objects that exist. So the definition of sufficient reason, DSR, remember that this whole point of this was to provide a formal equation for the definition of sufficient reason. In English, for all things that exist, a reason is sufficient for not X, if and only if the assertion of the inexistence of X is not a contradiction. So that's all it takes. This is all it takes for Descartes. Descartes does not want to have the possibility that it could be wrong. So all that's going to happen is, all that is required is that if you assert that something doesn't exist, and that assertion is not a contradiction, that's good enough. That's a reason that's a sufficient reason that it doesn't exist. Now you may not be satisfied with it, but it gets away entirely from psychological satisfaction, right? Because it gives a formal definition that says, that's it. Let's look at the assertion of inexistence and see if it's a contradiction.
Dennis, the very last line on your slide in brackets, where X and not X is the assertion of the inexistence of X. I assert that the phrase X and not X is the assertion of the existence of X and the assertion of the inexistence of X. It is not the case that bracket X and not X unbracket is the assertion of the inexistence of X.
So I think this goes back to like married bachelors. So implicitly you assert that something doesn't exist, where the definition, if you flesh it out, you'll see that the contradiction then appears. So
answer the phone. It's Descartes. Answer the phone.
That's Descartes calling in. Let's see what he has to say.
No, but where X and not X, you say where X and not X is the assertion of the inexistence of X. It's not. To say X and not X, I assert X and not X. I assert that John is both a bachelor and married. That is a false statement. And B,
Bill, let's give Dennis the benefit of being a student of logic, and let him give him a pass on this, and just let him present his argument. Let's hear the argument. You're arguing on the formality of the logical statement, but if you read the English part, it sounds fine to me. So let's go on.
Okay.
But wait, I'm sorry. I don't want to be a jerk, but Dennis is saying that he's grounding this in logic. And he's saying the phrase X and not X is an assertion of the existence of X. It's not. That is plain false. To assert X and not X is a false statement, but it asserts the existence of X and it asserts the non-existence of X. It does not only assert the inexistence of X. It asserts both. Hence, it's false. But I'm willing to go on, but I totally object to that line at the bottom of the statement. That's not the case.
That's fine. Bill was one of the very first people that I gave my paper to read, and he gave me a lot of good tips and information about how to make it better. So I appreciate Bill's comments here.
Here's your married bachelor. It's a man who has been living with his girlfriend for 7 years and 1 day. They've never married. They've never married through a justice of the peace. They've never married in a religious institution. He is a bachelor. He's unmarried, but he is married in common law. That's your married bachelor.
Then he's married.
But he doesn't
Then he's
recognize
married.
it. She doesn't recognize it. She doesn't know about the common law. He doesn't know. So it's like there's your married bachelor.
I just think that he's married. I don't think you can say he's a married bachelor, because that's a contradiction. I just won't accept that. So let me just make this further point though. So we've been trying to get to a definition of sufficient reason. We wanted one that was formal. We wanted one that was necessary, and we wanted one that was complete. And this makes complete. It's a very, very, very narrow definition of sufficient reason. Well, okay. So this will probably drive you guys crazy as well. That's fine. So the I who speaks. So we are now down to cogito. We're down to the I think. And so we want to make a claim. So what Descartes has done, right, in his arguments from illusion and from the dream and from the evil genius, is he has made a claim that each of these things do not exist, and he's found a sufficient reason. And the sufficient reason is that the evil genius is fooling us all the time, or there's a simulation, right? There's always something, there's some sufficient reason that it doesn't exist. And he's now standing there by himself. He has gotten rid of everything else, everything other than himself. And the only thing left is I, the cogito, the I think. And he asks himself, what about this? What about the cogito? Maybe the cogito, maybe I do not exist, right? That's the question he's going to ask. Do I exist? So what is the assertion of inexistence? The assertion of inexistence is I do not exist. And then you would give a reason for that. You would give some sufficient reason for that. This assertion, I do not exist, is a self-refuting performative contradiction. That's what it's technically called. And in fact, there is an article by Jaco Hintika, written in 1962, that talks specifically about Descartes and this performative contradiction. The propositional content that I do not exist contradicts the presupposition that I am the one who is asserting it, right? It's a performative contradiction. It is an existentially inconsistent statement. So the cogito is that logical I. So Descartes echoes this idea of the assertion of inexistence, because he says, I cannot doubt my own doubting. I cannot doubt my own doubting. So now we have this assertion of inexistence. I do not exist. And my claim is that this is a contradiction. It is a contradiction, a performative contradiction. If it is a contradiction, then there's no sufficient reason that can be given for not X. If there's no sufficient reason that can be given for not X, then X exists.
It's not a contradiction because the I, rather, which is just a placeholder like the word it in linguistics, the I is, it's empty, it's a cipher. The I that says, I do not exist, or the I that says the I that says, I think, therefore I am, is not the same I that began the sentence by the end of the sentence. In fact, by this second word, by even completing the phoneme I, that is not the same person. There are not the same neurons. There are not the same neurons firing. There's not the same actual perception of consciousness. There are every cell in the body is creating new proteins. Neurons are dying. There's the whatever, I don't believe in the Freudian unconscious, but some kind of subtending, unconsciousness is at work, and so there is no the person who makes the statement, I think, therefore I am, is lying, because they are not the same I that began the sentence.
So that is one of the arguments that we started with way back, which was the reduction to the brain, right? Neurophysiology of the brain. And so this argues against that. This says that the I does have, the cogito is that logical I. That there is something called the cogito, it's a logical I, and it's not identified with the brain.
Yeah, in the interest of
But that's
time,
nonsense,
how
because
many
it's
slides
the
do you have
res
left?
cogitans is a res extensa. So the entire idea is wrong. To have consciousness, you have to have those neural networks. Without them, if you are simply a res cogitans, that is
So
when
this is the thing.
you do not exist. If the res cogitans is always a res extensa, always.
Okay. I'm going to move on here. So, because it's almost 3 o'clock and I want to finish up. So here we are. Here, we finally made it. The negation of the principle of possibility. That's what we were looking for, right? We wanted to find, we have the principle of possibility says that there's a sufficient reason that nothing exists. And so now we have the Cartesian principle is a existential statement, which is a counterexample to the principle of possibility. And this is as a new symbol here, that exclamation point or bang. The Cartesian principle says there exists one and only one thing for which there is no sufficient reason for it to not exist, right? Formally, there is one and only one X in the set of things that exist X, such that for all R in the set of reasons R, there is no sufficient reason R for not X, where SR is in accordance with the DSR or the definition of sufficient reason. This is the Cartesian principle. This is the cogito ergo sum. And I'm going to move quickly here because it is 3 o'clock. And this one, do not go through all of this stuff, but this points to a very peculiar kind of being. So unlike the idea that the consciousness is totally reducible to the res cogiton or res, I think that the cogito is a very unique kind of entity, a unique kind of being. I call this is the first 1, 2, 3, 4 equations here are taken. I've used those. Those are standard equations of equivalence, of uniqueness. And all I've done is substitute it in. So and we're not going to go over this one, but the very last line in that table is what I call the principle of sui generis, or sui generis as Latin, the principle of sui. It's really just the principle of uniqueness. But when I used that name, the logical name came out as PU, and I thought, well, I don't want to give my critics a chance. Such an easy target there, so I changed it to the principle of sui generis. So now here we go. Here we are. These 5 equations, these 5 expressions are meant to capture Descartes' cogito arguments: the principle of possibility, the negation of the principle of possibility. Along with that, we have a definition of sufficient reason, which gives us the Cartesian principle, which then we can express the cogito and the being of the unique being of the cogito as a principle of sui generis. So this is where I was headed. So when I sat down, I started thinking about, and some of you came in late, but was how can I apply my these logical tools to the cogito argument, and how can I give this logical expression to this argument? It is this. So these are the 5 equations that express, in my mind, the cogito argument. So here's a secret. We said there's a Cartesian secret. You ain't never going to get rid of the cogito. That's the deal. You ain't never going to get rid of it. The cogito is grounded in the law of non-contradiction. If you go back to Aristotle's Metaphysics, book 3, I'm not sure. I think it's book 3. No, it's book 4, chapters 3 through 6. Aristotle gives a negative demonstration of the law of non-contradiction. And he says you cannot deny it. So the inability to deny the law of non-contradiction and the inability to deny the cogito are intimately linked. Now, I think there's a lot to be said there. I'm not going to say anything more, but I think they're intimately linked and tell us a lot about the nature of the cogito. I think there's a whole lot more. In fact, there's a whole other science. It's called phenomenology to describe that link, but there's a link between the laws of thought and the cogito, which identify the kind of unique being that is the cogito. The impossibility of negating the cogito, lies at the heart of the Freudian repression. People try to negate themselves. Sartrean bad faith, denial of self. The Faustian bargain is ultimately an attempt to deny self. The Heideggerian Das Man, I think is also a denial of self. Gene and I have had a lot of discussions about that. Some Eastern religions try to deny. I'm not an expert on Eastern religions or New Age philosophies, but they want to negate the ego, negate the I think. The Cartesian Principle asserts that the cogito is an ontological and a priori unity of thought and being that can never be pried apart. So philosophy is always trying in epistemology to unite thought and being. What we think, what we know, we want to know what is, thought and being. And they're always trying to get those two to come together. Here is an instance of a kind of being, the special kind of being that you cannot pry them apart. Thought and being are one. And that, we should go here. The last part, what is truth? This is the question of our times. Today, the principle of possibility reigns, or at least it did until January 20th. And I think it still reigns today. The truth has a characteristic that it must be asserted. And this is why propagandists assert the lie, the big lie, over and over and over again. They assert it over again. They all say it. It takes on the assertion of the patina of truth. Everything is declared as fake news. There's a reason everything is fake. CNN is fake. MSNBC is fake. The Dr. Fauci is a hoax. The pandemic is a hoax. This is the assertion of the principle of possibility. So that assertion, as I said, is an utterly nihilistic, and we have it on a grand scale in this country. Descartes has bequeathed to us with his cogito a bulwark against this obliteration, right? Everything else can go, but this stands as true. And it guarantees that the negation of reason will never prevail. So this is my talk. This is my presentation. I find it's a celebration of the cogito, and it's a celebration of Descartes, who I think has tremendous courage, and that we should all be thankful for Descartes and go back to him as often as we can. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So questions?
Before can you put your presentation on the meetup so we can reference it later?
Yes,
Right,
I will. So I also have an appendix which has all of the equations, and I would be satisfied, frankly, with presenting a paper that was just the equations. I mean, that's what this paper is all about, is just these equations. So
I think I'll make one comment on what I hear from you. Thank you, Dennis. That I echo Bill's concern about the formalism that you use to represent existence, because you did not use the existential quantifier for one, but at the same time, you're not using it as a predicate either. So perhaps that is where one would improve on the formulation of these propositions in the predicate logic that you're using. But the other option, of course, is to use the traditional Aristotelian logic. That's a possibility.
okay,
That's it.
thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. There is a question of, existent as a predicate. I try to avoid that. I don't think I'm using it as a predicate. I don't mean to, and I'm just trying to apply a logical expressions to the way we normally talk about existence. David, did you have something?
So you are asserting that without the cogito, there would not be a subject, and the subject has to rely on that cogito?
My assertion is pretty simple. You cannot deny the cogito. That's the main assertion. You cannot deny it. You can deny everything else in the entire universe, you can deny, but you cannot coherently, this is the point, you cannot coherently, without contradiction, deny the cogito. The cogito, I think, is the only thing that you cannot deny without contradiction. And I think that is a profound statement.
Right.
I think there's something quite profound about that. There's something quite unique about the cogito, that it is the one thing that cannot be denied without contradiction.
But in Heidegger's transformation of that into a Dasein, is that a kind of denial or transformation of the cogito as a subject?
It is a reinterpretation of the being of the cogito, and I think it's a rich, worthwhile, and I think there's reasons phenomenologically to use that interpretation. But cogito, I don't think Heidegger ever says, I do not exist. I don't think he ever denies the ego or denies the I. It's just, in fact, he asserts that it is in each case mine. The das Man is in each case mine. So the cogito is in each case mine as well.
It seems like a cogito is a kind of a dualism, where the consciousness is outside of the world of being, whereas Heidegger is saying that there is no such thing as a kind of being outside of the world, and so he's kind of disagreeing with Descartes in that sense, that there's no subject-object dualism there.
Well,
yes, being in the world means I am in the world and the world is in me, and it immediately breaks down the subject-object relation. That's the essential and very simple way to see it. I am in the world and the world is in me. Right now, I am breathing, I am saying this phrase. There are 6 atoms from the dying breath of Caesar in it, and the tiny droplets of spittle on my lips are from every single body of water on Earth. So I am in the world and the world is in me. There is no distinction between subject and object.
so I look at it phenomenologically, and the very heart of phenomenology is intentionality. And intentionality is an analysis of consciousness as mental acts and the content of those acts, of thinking and what is thought, of being in the world. There is a correlation between the conscious subject and the world that he is conscious of. And so this is a correlation that occurs before any decision about the reality of the world. So whether or not Julius Caesar did this, doesn't matter. This is what Heidegger is doing, is simply reiterating on a different plane what Husserl is saying when he says that every mental act is a noesis and a noema, an act and a content. It's being in the world. Husserl and Heidegger have 2 separate projects. Husserl wants to look at the essential nature of that mental, of the noesis noema correlation in terms of establishing the validity of logic. Heidegger is looking at the experience of consciousness, and that is the entire phenomenological description of our rich, concrete being in the world. I don't think that those 2 are in any way at odds with each other. A lot of people want to say that about, and there is, with good reason they say that. They want to say that about Heidegger. I don't look at it that way. I find Heidegger and Husserl to both be phenomenologists, but just applying them in a different way.
Yeah, but there's some,
The-
studies on consciousness where they're going, so far as to say that there is a kind of a panpsychism where consciousness is, at one with nature itself. Where does consciousness come from? It doesn't come from within the individual. Consciousness is relational with the world, and maybe it is a kind of a panpsychism.
Well, I guess that's possible from a phenomenological point of view.
The
question
problem
is-
with the whole notion of being in Heidegger is he
You're cutting out there, Victor.
he undermines his very concept of being in the title of being in time. As soon as being meets time, what you have is becoming. We would have to alter the very nature of language. There is no isness to things. There is only becoming. And even the word becoming would be a falsehood because it assumes that one comes to be, but there is never an instant that is brief enough in which one is. So all there is temporality. All there is. So being and time, the very nature of time undermines the very possibility of being. Nothing is a pure sameness. There are similarities, but there is no sameness, perhaps not even in, because the singularity of black holes are if there is a singularity, I do not think there is, it's constantly absorbing the micro-round background radiation. And so there is no sameness even in the singularity. As far as human beings, once again, I think, therefore I am, by the time you have finished the phrase, the I is no longer the same I. So as soon as being meets time, it annihilates time.
Okay.
It annihilates being.
So you're asserting a Heraclitean flux overall. I mean, you're absolutely Heraclitean flux.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's provable through physics.
So, well, that's assuming that you have assumed you're untitled. I don't want to go into that. I really don't want to go into that right now. So my question for everybody is this. Just go and ask yourself, can I coherently deny my own existence? That's all. Can I coherently deny my own existence? Can I make an assertion? Can I use language to coherently deny my own existence? David.
Yeah, so I'm interested in reading and parsing, the way you approach this. And I'd like to ask you a question, maybe save me a lot of time in trying to figure things out. When you make an assertion like S R X or S R not X, you're making an assertion that there's a relationship between two propositions, right?
There's a binary relationship there, yes.
Between two propositions, you're saying one proves the other.
Yes.
Okay. Why aren't you using the traditional implication arrow to say R implies X or R implies not X?
I use that in my paper, actually. I thought that I was thinking about the people that might be joining this, and I thought that maybe X because R would be more intuitive for them. That's all. But I actually use R implies X in the paper, and I guess I should have kept it in the presentation as well.
Because when you make the relation of S, as a set of sufficiencies, whatever S is, like a relation of the sufficiencies, which would be a Cartesian product between all the R's and all the X's, some subset of that would be the relation. So it could be possible that SRX and SR not X.
Could be.
A relation can contain things like that. But if you put the implication arrow in, then we wouldn't expect that to be the case. So you're assuming certain things about what it means to be sufficient, which is really a critical part of what this argument is. What does it mean to be sufficient? And if it really is about implication in a logical sense, merely logical implication, then it's different from a relation, because R can't be proving X and not X unless R itself is contradictory.
Well, yeah, in the discussion of Bigfoot, right? We had reasons for thinking Bigfoot exists and sufficient reasons for thinking it doesn't exist. And it's really the person who's hearing this and deciding for themselves whether or not those reasons are sufficient or not.
Yeah, but those are two
But there
different
are
sufficient reasons for two different conclusions. David's, I like David's thing of if you have a sufficient reason that leads to X and the same sufficient reason leads to not X, that would have been an interesting principle here. You can't be a sufficient reason if that reason can prove both X and non-X.
Right, it has no content.
Yeah.
Like
But-
saying, well,
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought of that, but yeah.
And then there's an extension of that. There's for any given X, there's a whole range of reasons for different, right? And you pointed out, if you're a scientist, you want more details. If you're, if it's a social thing, there's another reason or, but, some way to quantify that the reasons for X reasons could be in a whole range or set range or something like that.
Yeah, I
Well, the
agree.
The reason I was asking is because when you're doing first order predicate logic, there's usually a small number of assumptions that are axiomatic, which are equivalent to modus ponens and non-contradiction. And here it's as though we're starting with no axioms, so we can't actually do any proofs because there are no steps we could ever take, right? You have to have at least a minimal set. So it's sort of like, I'm not sure what they are. If you stated those, it would really help for me reading this.
Okay, I'll do that. One of the motivations of this as well was presenting, if you wanted to teach, I think if you could take these equations, you could teach Descartes' argument in a different way. So I think it has pedagogical value by putting them into these logical equations, and say, okay, let's test everybody. Let's not get bogged down in finding out whether or not illusions are we should trust our senses or not, but let's just test the truth value of a statement, whatever that truth value is. So I think it has pedagogic value in that sense. That was one of the ideas I had in mind.
You asked if anyone could use language to prove their non-existence. The word exist, the actual etymology of to exist, coming into English from the French, is to stand forth or to step out, to emerge. Okay, and what in order to continue in one's existence, as we use the word in the language, and it once again is a word that creates a philosophical error in the language, just as the word being creates a philosophical error in the language. You have to assent to continue to exist. You have to stand, not simply step out and stand forth. You have to stand outside yourself. You have to be an utterly new being, easily provable from the point of view of biology or physics in each instant. So while there is an illusion of continuity in the self, and there are degrees of it, unless if you're in a coma, there's degrees of continuity there, but there's no absolute continuity. The cogito is a meaningless phrase that is rife with all the errors with philosophical dualism, that is rife with the error of the fact that the res cogitans has to be a res extensa. It's rife with the error of the notion of ontology, of being and existence. There are here's one way that Heidegger begins to express this. He talks about the things thinging and the world worlding, which then express the temporality of these things and their imperfect lack of identity as they move through time. The things are thinging and the world is worlding.
I think there's a phenomenological way to demonstrate the cogito. But that's my next paper. That'll be my next presentation. As a matter of fact, I was actually working on an original paper, and then this idea came up, and I kind of went off on the side and it just took off from there. I would also like to say this. I'm going to close out here in a minute because my throat is about ready to close. I think that they teach philosophy wrong, all wrong, especially the beginning philosophy. They should teach philosophy. Philosophy course should be a writing course. It should always be about writing. You should always write. And even, you know, freshmen come in and they're presented with these ideas of these great thinkers, and they're said, well, what do you think about that? And these freshmen have no idea. Well, I don't think you should do that. I think you should say, summarize that, just write it. And the objection might be, well, geez, well, we want people to think for themselves. We don't want them just to think what other people think. Well, in order to summarize what Plato's saying or what Hume is saying, you have to think for yourself. You have to think about this thing very carefully. And so I would say an introductory philosophy course should be a writing course where you simply summarize these ideas. Later on, you can then let it grow your own ideas out of those, but first be able to articulate those ideas in a way, in an organized way, because what I have found is as I try, I have these ideas, and as I have to write them down, I really have to really think around the edges and really try to solidify where I'm going. Every philosopher, except for Socrates, was a writer, right? So philosophy is writing, and I would encourage everyone to write. It's really important. And my experience has been that it's a growth. I just feel like as I write, I just grow. And so that's my rant on teaching philosophy. I think it should be a writing course anyway. I appreciate everybody coming. Yeah.
Here is Descartes' main error. He applies skepticism, Pyrrhonism, or historical Pyrrhonism to all of philosophy, to all of his knowledge, to the lack of foundation in the science, seeking to find a foundation. What he fails to do is to apply initially, when he arrives at his conclusion about the cogito being his Archimedean point, he fails to apply that same radical Pyrrhonist skepticism to the cogito. Okay, if he had done so, then the cogito would not remain as a foundation, because there cannot be a foundationalist philosophy. If we're moderns, we have to accept the fact that there is no epistemological foundation, no ontological foundation, and that what we have are in the sciences are approximations that are sufficient, for instance, to perform tasks, but we do not have an understanding of the quantum realm. We do not have an understanding of the cosmological realm. Therefore, none of the sciences have an absolutely firm foundation. None of them. And they never will.
I would disagree that when you said that he tries to apply the radical doubt to the cogito. He does try to do that, and he finds that he can't do it because he can't doubt that he's doubting. I mean, that's what he says explicitly, that every time he tries to do it, he finds that he's doubting. So I would just disagree with that.
I'm going to exit. Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good discussion.
Yeah, it was a good talk. All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Nazarene, you there?
I'm here.
Yeah, thanks for showing up. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you this was really great. Thank you. I hope
Cool,
you
thanks.
do another presentation soon.
I will do another presentation. Thank you. All right, talk to you later. Bye. Thanks for your participation, Victor.
Thank you very much for appreciating it. I can't even imagine how one could come up with, because it's a foreign language to me, the language of logic, to be honest. I cannot possibly imagine how you could even seek to distill the cogito into 5 principles, of logical principles.
Thank you.
To me, it's like it's a translation of a translation of it's a 5-fold translation.
I figure, gee whiz, even if I'm wrong, I'm right? So just the attempt is good enough for me. All right, thanks.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
We'll
Thank
see
you.
you online. Where are you at, by the way?
I'm in New York City.
New York City. Cool. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Okay, take care.
Bye.